distinguished guest, and I'm going to introduce someone to actually do the introduction, but I need to tell you tonight that tonight's program is sponsored by the Program in Criminal Justice and Management at the Kennedy School. It's sponsored also by the Kennedy School Black Student Caucus and by the Student Advisory Committee of the Institute of Politics, which I'm associated with, which is why I'm here. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to present the person who also brought our guest to be a part of her study group, and she is one of the Institute of Politics Fellows this semester. It's Kathy Whitmire. For 10 years she was mayor of Houston, Texas, and she has been a businesswoman and a professor in her own right, and we're extremely pleased to have her here at the Institute of Politics, where she has a study group in leadership, and had our guest earlier today. This is about his third shot at Kennedy School and Harvard folks this afternoon, so we're working him hard, but I don't think any harder than he works every day of the week on behalf of the people of this country. Kathy Whitmire.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to introduce an individual that I'm always happy to introduce, because he has such an extraordinary background, and because I've had an opportunity to get to know him pretty well over the last 15 years or so. I want to tell you a little bit about Lee Brown. He has an extraordinary title, the Director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, a title long enough that it gets reduced to an acronym, but I couldn't pronounce the acronym, and so I guess no one else could either, so they just call him the drug czar. But he's really an ordinary human being, not a czar at all, and I want to give you a little bit more of his background. Lee Brown is Dr. Lee Brown, has a very distinguished number of academic credentials, including his doctorate in criminology from the University of California at Berkeley, also his master's degree in criminology from Berkeley, and his master's degree in sociology from San Jose State, as well as his bachelor's in criminology from Fresno State. He's also taught at Howard University, as well as Portland State University, but his academic career has really been a small part of his career. He has an extensive law enforcement career as well, having begun that law enforcement career as a police officer in San Jose, California, and later on became the sheriff, the appointed sheriff. I think a lot of them are elected, and he had the opportunity to be an appointed sheriff as well as director of justice services in Multnomah County, Oregon, which is the county where Portland is located, and then went on from there to be appointed the public safety commissioner responsible for police and fire protection services in Atlanta, Georgia. I had not heard of him through that distinguished career, but shortly after I was elected mayor of Houston, I was in need of a police chief. And police services were a big issue in my community. Crime was a big issue. Police management and the need for police reform were very big issues. It had been 40 years since our community, the city of Houston, had a leader, a chief in its police department to come from outside the department, something that's not always popular in law enforcement organizations. But I decided to do a national search as well as looking inside the department, and looked at a number of candidates from around the country and came to the conclusion that then Commissioner Lee Brown, with his extensive background in both law enforcement and the academic side of criminology, was probably the most qualified individual in the country to take on that assignment. As I mentioned, it was not necessarily popular to bring in a chief from outside the department. It was also a little bit of a shock, since there had never been an African American above the rank of sergeant in this particular police department up until that time. However, we did have a city council that at the time was also prepared to see some changes and some reforms and improvements in law enforcement in our community. At least the majority of them were, and that was all I needed, was a majority. And so I was able to go forward with the nomination of Lee Brown, and he was willing to take on what turned out to be a fairly challenging assignment. I think he probably knew at the time what he was in for, and came to Houston and served for 8 years as our chief of police. During that time, he went from being a controversial outsider coming into our department to being one of the most popular people in the city of Houston. In fact, there are still people I hear from today, as he does, saying, well, how soon is Lee Brown going to come back, because he needs to run for mayor next year in Houston, and they are still counting on him coming back to Houston one of these days, although he went on from our city to become the police chief in the city of New York, stayed there until 1992, came back to Houston briefly and joined the faculty at Texas Southern University, but from there, President Clinton asked him to take on the cabinet position of drug czar. And he did that and has done it for 2.5 years now, and very admirably has guided the administration in establishing its policies to tackle what I think is one of the most threatening problems to our nation even today, the problem of the illegal use of drugs and the effects of drug use and the drug trade. And I'm just delighted that he would take some time from his very busy schedule and his many duties in Washington to come and visit with us here at Harvard, to work with my study group this afternoon, and to join us in the Institute of Politics tonight and here in the forum. So I'm delighted to welcome to the podium Dr. Lee Brown.
Thank you. Let me begin by expressing my sincere appreciation to Mayor Whitmire for not only inviting me here, but also for such a generous introduction. As she indicated, I had the honor and pleasure of working with her as her police chief for 8 years in Houston, Texas. One thing I never shared publicly, I think I'll do it tonight, is that when she convinced me to come to Houston, and I didn't know anyone in town except her, and I came to the airport, there was no one there to pick me up. And so I caught a van to go into Houston, and I found out to my dismay that the van wasn't going to Houston. It was going to a mental institution in another city. And I certainly wanted to make a good impression when I got to the city, so I was in the back of the bus reading my materials for the press conference. There were 4 other people on that van. And soon 2 men walked in with white jackets, and he went to the first person and tapped him on the shoulder and says, "What is your name?" He said, "My name is Napoleon. I'm the Emperor of all France." He said, "Charlie, that's 1. Went to the next person and says, "What is your name?" "I am Queen Elizabeth, the Queen of England." And Charlie, that's 2. Went to the third person, says, "What is your name?" "Well, I'm Shakespeare, I'm the great writer." Said, "Charlie, that's 3. Went to the fourth person and tapped him on the shoulder and said, "What is your name?" He said, "My name is George Washington, the father of this country." He came to me and I was busily reading my papers. He tapped me on my shoulder. He said, "What is your name?" I knew everyone knew my name. I'm going to be the police chief in Houston, Texas. And I threw out my chest and said, "I am Lee Brown. I'm the new police chief in Houston, Texas." He said, "Charlie, that's 5. Let's go." So that was my introduction into Houston. But it is a pleasure to return, and I emphasize return, to the Kennedy School of Government here at Harvard University. I always look forward to the intellectual stimulation that comes from forums like this one, forums that are known for challenging discourses as well as spirited debate. I also want to, on a serious note, give recognition to Kathy Whitmire, the former mayor of Houston, who at one time, as we indicated, was my boss. She hired me as police chief, and I proudly served under her leadership for 8 years. And the Institute is very fortunate to have someone of such outstanding ability to teach about leadership styles, politics, and skills in public service. And for those of you who are students here, I urge you to take full advantage of her wisdom, her talents, and her experience. I was delighted to have the opportunity to meet some of you at our earlier dinner. And as a result of the conversations there, I know that I am now addressing an audience of divergent viewpoints spanning the spectrum of different ideologies as well as political perspectives. Yet putting differences aside for a moment, I believe that there is a concern that we all must share. And that concern is about the quality of life in this country that we call home. I say that because we're in the midst of a great debate about the future of this country, about the kind of society we have as we enter into the 21st century. It's a debate about how we will govern ourselves and the quality of our lives, what that will be. And I think President Clinton has said it well, and I agree. He said, if we do the right things now, the best days of this country are before us. As we struggle together to do what is right for this country, I believe that our deep concern about the future can indeed become a bond for Americans of differing viewpoints. And hopefully this bond can help us search for common ground, and hopefully higher ground as we grapple with some of the issues that continue to erode the American way of life as we currently know it. We all want a future where communities are shaped by the values we share, not those that divide us. We all want a future where families can provide the very best for themselves and the very best for their children. And we all want a future where children, no matter what the circumstances of their birth, can grow up to become socially responsible, productive citizens. But I submit to you this evening that there is a poison inflicting the fabric of this society that threatens all that we hold dear. It is a poison for which we must find an antidote, or it will consume us. And what I'm talking about are drug use and drug trafficking, which together serve to undermine the quality of life in many of this nation's cities, towns, and neighborhoods. It's in that context that this evening I want to discuss with you what I believe has become an American crisis. I want to look at those obstacles that stand in the way of our finding effective and meaningful solutions, and I will examine why complacency is perhaps our worst enemy, how the search for a simple solution often shapes misguided notions, why the rise in adolescent drug use is a threat to all of us, and how societal inequities make too many Americans vulnerable to the lure of drug trade, drug use, drug trafficking. The way I see it, these are our real enemies. And until we can overcome them, we will not be able to remove the specter of the drug problem from our society. How many of you have ever thought because you don't use drugs, you really need not worry yourself about that problem? This notion gives rise to apathy, or really a sense of denial that undermines our quest for a truly drug-free society. Complacency keeps us stuck. It gets in the way of real action because it allows too many to believe that the problem isn't really a problem at all. There are still those who believe that because we have been successful in bringing casual drug use down, and I mean down significantly, that in effect a huge part of the problem has been solved. But let me take a minute and just share with you some statistics about drug use in this country, and hopefully putting an end to any thoughts that the drug crisis is a manufactured one with little or no merit. 78 million Americans have experimented with illicit drugs at least once in their lifetime. There are 12.2 million Americans currently using drugs, that is at least once a month. Nearly one-half of high school seniors, regardless of race or gender or location, have tried an illicit drug, and 1 in 5 has used drugs on a regular basis. Americans spend $49 billion a year purchasing drugs, and the economic cost to us as a society total almost $67 billion annually. Heroin and cocaine hospital emergency room episodes are going up, increasing every year, with 20,000 drug-related deaths occurring each year. And our prisons are overburdened with drug offenders. This data is very telling. What it says is that whether you use drugs or not, you are impacted by the drug problem. It also underscores the point that to deny the dimensions of the problem is really foolhardy. We have to face the issue and face it head on if we are to have any hope of finding a viable solution. I'm sure that many residents of the college town of Amherst, Massachusetts, thought that the drug problem was something they would never have to face in their town. Yet just a few weeks ago, a high school student from a middle-class family died from a drug overdose. This student had been snorting heroin frequently and obtained it from a supply from a local college student who was also a user. It turns out that the same college student was supplying heroin for a number of other young users in the area. It wasn't long after that incident in Amherst that 4 middle-class individuals from the Boston area died from a heroin overdose. Newspapers reported the shock of residents in the suburban Boston community because one of the dead was a popular high school basketball coach. And while it's easy to be concerned when someone like us is hurt by drugs, there are those people who refuse to consider the drug users who are the toughest to reach. And here I refer to the chronic, the hardcore addicted user who wreaks havoc on society by high rates of criminal activity, by violence, and negative health consequences. These are the people who account for up to 2/3 of the illicit drugs consumed, yet they comprise only 20% of all of the drug users. So why should you care about hardcore drug users? Why can we ill afford to ignore them? Drug traffickers will continue to supply drugs to addicted users, and addicted users will continue to do whatever they must to get the drugs they need. As long as there are addicted drug users, the tranquility and the security of American communities will be in jeopardy. And while the drug traffickers are supplying those already addicted, they spend their time seeking new markets. For the trafficker to stay in business, they must continue to develop a new generation of users to provide the profits that business depends upon. Creating new generations of drug users, in my estimation, one of the most serious offshoots of the drug problem. It means that with each new generation, there's a threat, and we're experiencing that threat right now. American youngsters are at risk because all indicators suggest that drug use among the young, especially adolescents, is on the rise. This is not, I urge you, to be taken lightly, because we're talking about the future of our country. We're talking about our children. They represent our future. Any study on adolescent drug use trends that you want to look at confirms what we already know. Marijuana use is up and availability is high. Many students report that it's fairly easy or very easy to get marijuana. And still others report that it's easy to get cocaine, methamphetamines, PCP, and uppers. I suspect some of you here in the room might be parents, and still others probably are thinking about becoming parents one day. But whether you have children or not, do you want to live in a society where 11 and 12-year-olds have easy access to drugs that could do serious harm to their bodies and their minds? Do we want to live in a society where children fear going to school because of guns and drugs? The answer, of course, is no. As a nation, we have got to deal with the drug problem now before it gets worse, before more lives are ruined, before it grows out of control. Every adult in this country has a stake in correcting this wrong. What we need is a consistent, no-use message to youngsters that is unequivocal. We can't say that cocaine and heroin are bad for you and then merely blink at the use of marijuana. Children will quickly recognize this kind of hypocrisy for what it is. Again, the message has to be clear and it has to be consistent. Over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle said, it is a matter of real importance whether our early education confirms in us one set of habits or another. Indeed, in fact, it makes all the difference in the world. So my friends, what Aristotle said was correct 2,000 years ago, and it is correct today. Early education, the values which we instill in our young people, still makes all the difference in the world. So we must teach our children the value of a drug-free life, and the importance of this cannot be underestimated. The recent report of the Carnegie Council on Adolescent Development said, and I quote, "Using drugs may be a way of feeling mature, courageous, sophisticated, or grown up for many young people. The use of drugs, even the sale of drugs, constitute an attractive path to which they perceive an adult status." The cultural environment in which our youngsters live pushes many into a premature adulthood where using drugs, alcohol, and cigarettes is seen as sophisticated, seen as being cool. Rock and rap music groups don't help by extolling the virtues of drug use, the likes of which we've not seen in several decades. T-shirts and other fashions often featuring marijuana leaves, Phillies blunts, and pot figures have become big sellers and big business. The influence of all these negative images, in my estimation, is a threat to our ability to reach youngsters with age-appropriate messages, encouraging them to stay drug-free. We need to reduce the level of violence, drug use, and other self-harming media images and messages our children receive, messages that condone, glamorize, or legalize these negative behaviors. Reaching our young people is a serious obstacle that we must face. We all have a stake in creating a cultural environment that nurtures, that does not endanger our children. When I talk about the media and entertainment industries, I know full well that the problem goes far beyond this. In fact, there are no easy answers, even though many would have us believe that there are. The search for easy answers has taken us down the well-worn path of misguided solutions that only serve to distract us from what should be our real mission. In recent months, you've heard that we need to execute more people. You've heard we need to imprison more people. You've heard that we need to legalize drugs and take the profits out of the drug trade. All of these notions are offered as a simple solution to the drug problem and drug trafficking. Let me remind you of the quote of a renowned journalist who said, "There's always an easy solution to every human problem, neat, plausible, and wrong." I have spent over 30 years in law enforcement, and I know that we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. We cannot execute our way to a solution to this problem. How many more people are we going to lock up before we realize that this is not going to solve the problem? The drug trade is still flourishing and destroying more families and communities every day. And the legalization argument simply will not go away. What is particularly dismaying is that Much of the legalization debate is based on the faulty notion that since people are going to use drugs anyway, we might as well get out of the way and let them. Without laws that make drug use illegal, some experts estimate that we could easily have 3 times as many Americans using cocaine and crack. And this has a direct correlation to the crime and violence that grips so many of our neighborhoods, so many of our communities. Making drugs more readily available could only propel more individuals into a life of crime and violence. Making addictive, mind-altering drugs legal is an invitation to disaster for communities, many that are already under siege. How could we as a nation ever consider the possibility of helping more human beings destroy themselves, not to mention what they do to their families and to their neighborhoods? We have a solemn obligation as citizens to support policies for the common good, policies that foster the best in us, not the worst. And this brings me to an issue that makes many uncomfortable. And I'm talking about the role that societal and economic inequities play in the persistence of drug use and drug trafficking. There's no denying that the loss of hope and sense of alienation that pervade some segments of this society are underlying factors in the drug crisis, creating jobs and real opportunity for the people who need it most are excellent deterrents to the crime and misery that goes with the drug trade. We cannot continue to have a widening disparity in income between those at the top of the ladder and those at the bottom, and expect that people will not turn to the underground economy in order to survive. While our economy has grown tremendously during the past few years, all Americans have not benefited from this growth. In the 1950s and 60s and early 70s, all income brackets in the United States grew at roughly the same levels. However, for the past 15 to 20 years, this has not been the case. In fact, the upper 40% have seen their incomes rise, but the lowest 60% have seen their incomes decline. And the unemployment rate among inner-city African-American men with less than a high school education is nearly 50%. This kind of economic disparity tears at the nation's social fabric. What we have to do is make sure that all Americans have real opportunity to participate in this economy. And this is why the Clinton administration is committed to making investments in people, investments in education, investments in training, and investments in our inner cities. We have to give people reasons to say no to drugs and crime. And one of the best ways of doing that is to provide them with the tools they need to compete in the global marketplace. Without opportunities, we will continue to see the loss and hopeless souls who become the prime targets of the drug dealers. Remember that drugs don't always kill outright. They also kill quietly by destroying hope, by destroying values, by deadening the soul. I hope you can see that the issue of drugs is a very complex one that will not succumb to any one simple solution. We have to fight complacency and the search for the quick and easy answer. We have to reach our youngsters with a strong, unequivocal message about the dangers of drugs. And we have to find ways to restore hope to those living in the margins of our society. But if I can leave you with one message this evening, it would be this. We need you to help the broader public understand the importance of substance abuse as a national issue. Here at Harvard is the leadership, the intellectual resources, and the vision to help us galvanize our fellow citizens to confront substance abuse in its broader terms. We must collectively change our society's direction and move aggressively to combat substance abuse in any form. If we can tackle these obstacles that block our path to progress in an honest and in a forthright way, I trust that we'll be successful in realizing the goal of a drug-free America in the 21st century. Thank you for your kind attention. I'll be glad to take your questions now.
Thank you very much. And I think we have some microphones set up for those who might have questions on each side of the room. If you would please go up to the microphone, and if possible, just let us know who you are when you ask your question.
Hello, my name is Enrique Chaux. I am a graduate student in Boston University. I come from Colombia, specifically from Cali. And as many of you might know, there is an enormous levels of violence in Colombia, and much of that violence is related to drugs. But it's not related to drugs in the way you mentioned, that there's a correlation between drugs and violence directly, but it's a correlation between drugs and the fact that between violence and the fact that drugs are illegal. And one thing that has amazed me in cities of Boston, in the city of New York, the correlation between crime and drugs is not drugs by itself, it's the fact that drugs are illegal. And so I guess the problem, I conceive the problem as it has been, I think it has been misunderstood. The problem should not be understood as how to fight drugs, how to decrease the traffic and the trade of drugs as much, but to try to find alternatives in which legalization could be done. And you mentioned that legalization would be the easy solution, and I won't agree with that. I mean, I think there has to be a very large research in the academic research, and many people could internationally participate in a debate on the best way to come up with alternatives to legalized drugs. And so if we are really concerned about decreasing violence, I think the problem should be understood better.
If the essence of your statement is that we should legalize drugs, then I would respectfully disagree with you. Even in your country, where 80% of the cocaine that's distributed throughout the world comes through the Cali cartel, it's a criminal organization. And no one suffered more from those criminal organizations than Colombians. The number of people who have needlessly lost their lives, even though that cartel is not as vicious as the Medellin cartel was in bombing public areas, corrupting public officials, doing things that make your democracy very unstable. These are things that we have to be concerned about. The Cali cartel probably nets almost $6 billion annually by exporting poison to other parts throughout the world. And as I travel throughout our country, I see the end of the cocaine trail in cities in America. So our position is rather clear on the legalization issue. President Clinton has spoken now. We're unequivocally opposed to any public policy that would increase drug use. And even going beyond that point, I think one has to ask, at least for the United States, some very basic questions. What would one want to legalize? LSD, PCP, cocaine, crack cocaine, heroin. I know young people in this country that are 8, 9 years of age who are already addicted to drugs. Do we as a nation want to supply their habit for the rest of their life? I think not. I visited, and I urge anyone who would consider legalization to do as I've done, visit a hospital and go to the wards where they care for babies born to mothers addicted to crack, and hold in your arms, as I have done, those babies that are born weighing less than 2 pounds with tubes running in and out of the body, desperately clinging to life, and ask, do we want to legalize that which causes that? I think not. Or visit a crack house and see the misery and despair and the human degradation that takes place there. Do we want to legalize that? I think not. Or have the opportunity to receive a phone call in the middle of the night from a mother who says that her son has returned home and literally ran her out of the house after destroying the furniture. Do we want to legalize that which causes that? I would suggest not. I have looked at this issue and I know of no success story any place in the world where legalization has been successful. So at least for the United States, and I certainly hope for your country too, that legalization would not be an issue that's given any serious consideration. Here, it's not going to happen.
Hi, my name is Dan Lindberg. I'm an undergraduate at the college. You spoke about oversimplified answers to the solution. With our overcrowded prison system, releasing violent criminals sometimes, often non-violent criminals convicted under mandatory sentencing rules for drug offenses are left in prison. Wouldn't mandatory sentencing for drug offenses seem like one of the oversimplified solutions to the problem?
The Congress did pass legislation that called for mandatory sentencing, and this is particularly a timely issue in that those who use crack cocaine receive mandatory time in prison. Those who use powder cocaine and we get probation. It's timely in that this issue was recently revisited by the Congress as a result of the Sentence Commission making its recommendation. And the Sentence Commission asked to do away with the disparity between crack and powder cocaine. From my perspective, the existing law has two problems. Number one, our prisons are being overcrowded with low-level possessors of crack cocaine and not having room for those who are threats to our public. And number two, there's a disproportionate number of African Americans that are in our prison. When the Sentence Commission made its report to equalize crack powder cocaine, the Congress voted not to accept their recommendation or their report back. And so the law did not change. But I would intend to agree with you that we have to look at alternatives. Incarceration is not the only way to provide punishment for those who violate the law. I'm a very strong supporter of treatment, for example, and I speak not as a social worker, but as a police officer. I believe that if we're going to deal with those who are addicted to drugs, the only way I know to do so is to provide treatment programs. I'm a strong supporter of prevention. I think we have to have prevention programs to keep people from using drugs to begin with. Education is critical. The President has a national drug control strategy that's comprehensive, but yet more balanced than has been the case in the past. And that his strategy places a greater emphasis and indeed more resources into reducing the demand for drugs through prevention programs, education programs, treatment programs, while not neglecting enforcement or interdiction or our international programs.
Hi, good evening. My name is Vincent Bradley, and I'm a master's student at the School of Education. You briefly just touched on my question. You mentioned drug paraphernalia, such as T-shirts and music, promoting drug use. And I'd like to know what type of public policy does the Clinton administration and yourself advocate to curtail this glamorization of drug use? And specifically, if your answer involves education, how is funding and implementation possible with the current Congress?
We're concerned about many aspects that in some way may seduce our young people, whether it's look-alike products where legal substances are packaged to look like illegal substances. We've taken that on as an issue and received some voluntary compliance. We're concerned about the glamorization of drugs in the communications and entertainment industry. And to that extent, the President has convened a meeting at the White House of the CEOs of the communications and entertainment industry and briefed them on the drug problem and asked them to become part of the solution and not the problem. So the policy is voluntary compliance. I've also met with the Entertainment Industry Council and talked to them about some of the things we see in movies and videos as well as movies, and asked them for self-regulation. I think the fact that they had a meeting dealing with youth, drugs, and crime is an indication that they recognize the problem. I spoke to them as a parent and a grandparent because they too are parents and grandparents, and they too run the risk of their children being involved in the use of illegal substances. So the specific answer to your question, we think we can use the bully pulpit or the office of the president in order to get the message out and ask for compliance in those areas that I just mentioned. Now, a much more difficult issue deals with our Congress. We do have what I believe to be the correct strategy in addressing the drug problem. For example, I know of no other way to deal with addiction than treatment. And thus, we asked the Congress for this fiscal year for $355 million new dollars to treat the chronic hardcore addicted drug user. Congress gave us $57 million, far, far less than what we need. We're now in the process for the fiscal year 96 budget. The President requested $500 million for the Safe and Drug-Free Schools program, the only federal program that serves 40 million students, 94% of the school districts. The House has already voted to cut that back by 60%. It doesn't make sense to me. And I ask myself, what is Congress thinking about? At a time when drug use is going up, they want to cut back on the only federal program we have to help our young people. The crime bill, which was passed, was historic in that it had provisions for prevention funds. The House has already voted to revisit the bill and take $2.5 billion of our prevention funds and put it into prison construction. I visited a high school, or a junior high school in Washington, myself and the Secretary of Education talking about the safe and drug-free schools. And a young junior high school student asked us the question, what message are you sending to the children of America if you take our prevention funds to build more prisons? I think that's an appropriate question for us to ask our Congress. To make a long story short, we're seeing almost in all of our drug control budgets, cut. We're doing all right with DEA and FBI and our domestic enforcement. We're not doing as well in our international programs or our demand reduction programs. We happen to believe in the administration that we can't look at the drug issue in isolation. Demand, supply should not be competing entities. The reason being that our prevention and treatment programs can't take effect if there's an abundance of drugs on the streets. But the same token, our supply efforts won't be successful unless we can reduce America's appetite for drugs. So we're still making progress even with the limitations that I shared with you. A young man mentioned his hometown, Colombia. With our support, the Colombian government have been very aggressive in attacking the Cali cartel. We've been able to arrest 6 of the top kingpins. In Peru, with our help, the Peruvian and Colombian governments have been able to close down the air bridge where the cocaine base is flown from Peru to the laboratories in Colombia. Bolivia has been able to eradicate over 2,000 hectares of the cocoa leaf. On the domestic side, we find that drug use is really level right now. The big problem that I see is the fact that our young people are now using more drugs, particularly marijuana, and a lesser degree LSD and inhalants. But I also see throughout this country more and more people getting involved in individual and collective ways to help address the problem. That's what it's really going to take, all of us working together. If we're going to win the battle, we really have to want to change from within, where parents assume responsibility for their children, individuals assume responsibility for their own actions. We put aside our differences and take back our neighborhoods, child by child, house by house, block by block. I think that way it can be done.
How are you, Mr. Brown? My name is Gustavo Pombo. I am one of those 30-something million of Colombians, decent and honest, that suffer from drugs. And it strikes me every time I go to the streets around this country and I see people buying, and with that money, the best leaders of our country have been killed in the last 5 years. Our democracy has been put in threat. And I see that the hard part of the American policy in drugs has been on the supply side. There are the news and there are like the efforts. And from the demand side, you never heard in the news about the distribution cartels, the New York, the Boston, and Chicago cartels, because that amount of drugs to be distributed, it's not handled by the cartels. That, as you say, they are under arrest, or in the Medellin cartel, most of it almost dismantled because the people are there. I don't know if it's on the agenda of this government to balance that proportion of effort in the foreign policy of drugs and the domestic policy, because it seems to be unbalanced.
Mm-hmm. Now, we often hear from our allies, and Colombia is a very important ally to the United States in the drug battle, that we should do more about the consumption problem in the United States. I agree with you. And that is the reason that this administration is placing a much greater emphasis on reducing the demand for drugs. But as I indicated earlier, there's no single answer to the problem. We have to have a comprehensive approach. Just this past week, the President spoke at the United Nations, where he pointed out that we're going to continue to work with those countries that demonstrate the political will to address the problem, but by the same token, we're going to freeze the assets of those individuals and their organizations that are exporting the poison to this country and other countries throughout the world. And he called upon the countries to make sure that there's no sanctuary for those gangsters that are involved in illegal drugs, terrorism, and other crimes that have international implications. And so I agree. But as far as our foreign international efforts, we view it as being the responsibility of each country to address the problem in their country. And thus it's Colombia's responsibility to address the growth of the coca leaf and the opium poppy and the drug cartels in Colombia. Our position is to help those countries that have demonstrated the political will to do so. Colombia is a sovereign nation. We can't go into their country and tell them what to do. If they want to receive our help, then they request, and with the resources we have at our disposal, we're prepared to help. But again, from my perspective, it's each country's responsibility to address the problem. We will continue to address the drug problem in this country. At the peak of drug use in America, we had some 25 million Americans using drugs. That is now down to about 12 million. Now that's still a lot of people who use drugs, but that's a significant reduction. Almost 50% reduction in the use of drugs in this country. We don't hear much about that, but we are working on in the effort to reduce the consumption of drugs as a top priority. In fact, the President's drug control strategy has as its overarching goal to reduce the demand for drugs in America.
Hi, my name is Akil Uni. I'm a first-year master's student here at the Kennedy School. You spoke about the importance of demand-side reduction, but you also alluded to the importance of interdiction, specifically for domestic trafficking. Could you expand upon specific policies on improving the curtailing of trafficking in this country? Mm-hmm. As you said, that more arrests aren't going to work.
At the federal level, we have the Drug Enforcement Administration, which has the primary responsibility to deal with drug enforcement. However, we do have a number of other agencies that work with them, the FBI, the Customs, IRS, Immigration, Border Patrol. A whole range of federal agencies are involved in our interdiction effort at our border, at our ports of entry, as well as enforcement in the mainland. In addition to that, we also have state and local police, county police working in drug enforcement. So there is a comprehensive approach to addressing the problem. I speak, for example, as someone who has headed different police agencies. Use New York as an example. In New York, when we dealt with a comprehensive enforcement program, we had a task force comprised of DEA agents, state police, and New York City police that focused on the high level, those who brought drugs into the country, into the state, into the city. Then we had another level of other people in the Bureau of Narcotics that dealt with those who distributed, if you would, the wholesalers. At the precinct level, you have those who are dealing with the drug trade on the street level. So we do have a comprehensive approach. And I might also add that on a regular basis, we're also arresting the kingpins in the United States. In fact, when I was in New York, on a regular basis, we call a press conference where we've arrested those individuals who are dealing with drugs in New York City, distributing drugs throughout the rest of the country. And so we're not saying that our efforts are solely geared toward an international program. That's just one component. We also have aggressive enforcement at the domestic level. But again, I guess if I make my point, we have to be comprehensive. We have to address all aspects of it. I just happen to believe that in addition to all that we do, we can't just address drugs, crime, and violence, the symptoms. We also must address the underlying causes. And that's why the Clinton administration views the drug problem different than previous administrations. Previous administrations looked at the drug problem in isolation. We feel that drug control must be an integral part of overall policy, both foreign and domestic.
My name is Mary. I'm a certified paralegal. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right. My question for you is, first of all, I'd like to congratulate the Clinton administration. I think that the public is not aware about how much that Mr. Clinton has actually done. I'd like to see him take an hour on TV and do a chart the way that some others have done it. I'm really impressed by some of the things he's done.
I'll give that advice to him.
Don't tell him I said it. The question I have for you, some of us would like you to get a lot tougher and not just give treatment. We believe this is a war against our young people, and particularly in the black communities. It's destroyed a whole generation of young men and young women. Day before yesterday, I had a young woman who was using crack laugh at me and say that she was pregnant and using crack, and that no one was going to prosecute her. Even though there's laws on the books, no one is taking them seriously. Some of us would like to see you use the death penalty for serious kingpins. We would like to see a death penalty, and I know I'm not alone. We would like to see a death penalty on the record.
We have that on the record already. There's already the death penalty for the drug kingpins. You're not alone. The speaker also called for that.
Can I ask you?
And he voted against the bill that would allow that to happen.
There are some things I like about him. What about the liquor industry? What about the relationship between cocaine distributing and the liquor industry? And what is being done about that? And it seems as if every university in the country is targeted by the drug dealers. I mean, is there a policy of looking at, because these are young people with money, is there a policy dealing with that?
The policy of the federal government, and I would also say state and local government, will be to focus on in any illegal activity. I'm not aware of any where the liquor industry is also trafficking in drugs. I'm just not aware of that. That's a new one to me.
Thank you very much.
I'm Mary Jo McGuire, and I'm a mid-career student here. I'm also from Minnesota. My question actually deals with the issue of cocaine babies and babies born under the influence, and the controversy that surrounds what we do with the mothers of these babies, and whether we do prosecute them or what we can do about that issue. And I was just curious as to where you stood on that issue.
I'll answer that in a broader context. I don't think we can solve all of our problems by putting people in jail. I would have to raise the question, what social benefit would be derived by taking a mother and putting that mother in jail because she has a substance abuse problem? Personally, I'd rather see treatment made available to that mother. We have to look at substance abuse for what it is. It's a chronic relapsing disorder, like any other disorder. If you're going to beat it, you have to treat it. And that's what I would like to see happen, rather than trying to rely on arrest as the primary or the sole way to address problems. I think I'll do more in the area of treatment for those who need treatment, who are addicted to drugs and can benefit from treatment.
Hi, Mr. Brown. My name is Paul Mossman. I'm first year at the Kennedy School. As well, I've participated in Operation Snowcap, so I have a similar perspective on this. There's two questions in your discussion this evening, or there's two issues in your discussion this evening that would appear to be in conflict. One of which is that you're sending a message of empowerment vis-a-vis don't use drugs, take control of your life. At the same time, though, there seems to remain in your speech a number of suggestions that we're retaining agency, from the individual in the form of laws. That is, if you don't obey this message, then we're going to enact mechanisms to enforce this message. So I guess at a sort of a philosophical level or theoretical level, there's a conflict in terms of agency, who's going to retain agency. That's one issue. Secondly, with respect to the legalization argument, one of your first statements is you said that it was based on the premise that demand exists. And it seems as though as I go through your speech that there is a certain degree of demand. You articulated that in the form of dead weight loss, or if I would have termed dead weight loss, the economic cost, the $67 billion, the $49 billion that the consumers are spending. So perhaps you can clarify for me, one, does demand exist? And two, is there a conflict between this message of empowerment with respect to the laws?
Is your question, does demand exist? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, sir, because it seems as though one of your major critiques of the legalization is that it was based on the premise that demand exists. Therefore, we could legalize it and the market forces will take over to correct it. And it seemed as though in your speech you were saying that demand does not exist. In fact, people really don't want to use drugs.
If I said demand does not exist, that's not what I said. The fact that Americans spend $49 billion a year purchasing drugs tends to tell us that demand does exist. The fact that for the first time in the history of this country, the majority of the people in our federal prison are there for narcotic violations tells us that demand exists. What I would hope to convey is that the overarching goal of the policy of the president is to reduce the demand for drugs. I believe that. If there's no demand, then there's no supply. And so our objective is to reduce the demand. Now, in terms of conflict, what I wanted to convey to you is that from the federal government's perspective, we want to empower local governments to deal with the problem at the local level. The federal government alone will not be able to solve the problem. There are things we can do. We can provide some funding, some leadership, some direction, but the battle will be won or lost at the local level. And that means also that we have to enforce the laws. If there are violations of the law, my position is that people should be punished if they are convicted for violations of the law. And saying that, that's not to suggest that everyone goes to prison, but rather we can be creative and have alternatives to incarceration as a means of providing services to individuals. For example, in this country, we arrest literally hundreds of thousands of people every year for criminal violations, and the majority of them have substance abuse problems. It seems to me that we need to treat those individuals while we have them in the criminal justice system. We can look at nonviolent youthful offenders and have boot camps, but a different type of boot camp than we've seen before, where in the boot camp they can receive education, they can receive vocational training, and when they are finished, they can also have aftercare, so they go back into the communities with the skill and can get a job and not fall into the same traps that they had before. Also, we have strong advocates of prevention programs, and to take money from the crime bill, to me, just does not make sense. The president likes to say we need to give our kids something to say yes to. That's what the prevention monies did. Also, the drug court's a very effective means of an alternative to incarceration, where judges can tell individuals, you go into treatment, get your life back on track, I'm going to watch you, and if you don't, we're going to put you in jail, have the sanctions of the criminal justice system hanging over that person's head. There's a whole array of things that can be done. Our strategy calls for doing that. My office is developing a prevention network for federal government to link in with public and private at the local level, so we all can share information and have a movement, if you would, a crusade to keep young people from using drugs to begin with. I'm convinced that it can be done, but it's going to take each individual working, doing their own part in order to make a difference.
And I must announce that will take two more questions, and then we'll cut it off due to the lateness of the hour.
Great. Hi, my name is Chris Maringer. I'm in my first year at a Master's of Public Policy program. You mentioned several questions ago that the United States government can't simply go into Colombia and tell them what to do, but that seems very much like what the government did in Panama. I was hoping you could comment on that briefly.
That wasn't on my watch. We can have some influence indirectly. For example, by law,
that was kind of direct influence, no? Just out of curiosity. I mean, we really went in there. We didn't necessarily just influence.
I don't have any more details on that than you do, so I'll answer it in an indirect way. I wasn't in my position then, so I can't tell you what happened. I read about it in the papers just as you did. But we do have one way of exerting our influence. The president is required by law to certify to the Congress that the major drug-producing or transiting or trafficking countries are cooperating with the United States in addressing the drug problem, or on their own doing what's necessary to carry out the provisions of the 1988 Vienna Narcotics Treaty. If we do not certify a country, then the United States will not give that country any foreign aid except in counter-narcotics and in some instances humanitarian aid. But also of equal importance, the United States will oppose any request from a multinational financial address the problem in their own country.
Thanks for being here tonight.
Pleasure.
My name is Karen Clark, and I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. I have two questions. One of them has to do with what I do when I'm not here. I'm a state legislator in Minnesota. And when I go home, and I was just there recently, one of the main concerns is where are we going to get the resources for prevention. It's very, very distressing to continue to hear the stories about Congress cutting whatever the president requests. So I guess my question to you and to the president would be, why not, aren't we at a point where if we have a Congress that won't provide what we need in terms of prevention dollars or treatment dollars, particularly treatment dollars right now, why doesn't the president declare an emergency, a public health emergency, some sort of emergency that then gets around the Congress and so on? And we're kind of trying to look at that in our own state, but it needs to be a federal policy, I believe, some sort of direction like that. The second question I have is, I
think I heard this correctly as I was leaving the House this morning. I thought I saw President Clinton on television defending a position that kept the distinction between crack cocaine and cocaine as two different levels of incarceration and mandated sentencing. And I was very disturbed to hear that, because I think we should probably raise cocaine to the other level. Although I don't think that jails is the way to, they're not the way to solve this either, and that's why we need to put dollars into treatment. If you could comment on those 2 points.
On the latter question, the President did sign the bill that's presented to him by Congress, which maintains the status quo. And the reason he did that is because, number one, the votes were not there to sustain a veto. Number two, his position is we do not want to lower the penalties. And number three, he's directed the Sentencing Commission to go back and visit the issue and come back with recommendations that would take care of the inequity. He's concerned about the inequity that exists, but the reality is, if he did veto it, the votes were not there to sustain it. Some of the Congressional Black Caucus, some of the few people that wanted to accept the Sentencing Commission's report to equalize the two. On your other question, I'm not aware of any legal authority that the administration has to declare a national emergency because of the narcotics situation in this country. I'm just not aware of the law existing for that to occur.
On that, let me thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for being with the audience.